2. Here for our Education Committee. I suppose we'll get started now that everybody's here. I suppose maybe just first we'll just go around and do some introductions since it's a small group, and I don't know everybody, so. I'm J.P. Clausen. I'm on the Board of Directors.
Which way you want to go?
Let's go this way.
Matt Degner, Superintendent.
Sean Eystone, Director.
Michelle Baxter, Liberty Math Teacher.
Heidi Anderson, Secondary Math Curriculum Coordinator.
Emily Stone, Iowa City West.
Nick Proud, Executive Director of Teaching and Learning on the secondary side.
Amy Kortmeyer, Deputy Superintendent. Diane Schumacher, Executive Director of Teaching and Learning on the elementary side.
Lisa Williams, Board Member.
Kim Colvin, Board Recording Secretary.
Charlie Eastham, Board Member.
Great. So I guess who am I turning it over to? Heidi.
Okay,
Great.
cool. It feels a little silly to say this, but I will anyway. So thank you guys so much for letting us come and talk to you about some of the exciting stuff that's happening in math this year. As you probably know, we have some big changes to our program. And I think this is the 9th week of school, so we're 9 weeks into that, and so we want to talk about that a little bit. Just to give you a run through of what we'll do today, we'll start with what were those changes, just so that everyone knows kind of what we did, some early successes that we've experienced, and then what's our ongoing work and that we're working on, I guess. So the first thing I want to show you, and this is a little hard to read, but I think it makes the point clear. And this is historically what we've had in Iowa City for our math sequence, pathways, tracks, program of studies. There's lots of different language we could use to describe this. If you take a look, anything over here in the red would be, and so I'll just, in case you can't see this on your slides or something, anything in the red would have been considered in our slower paced sequence. Our regularly paced sequence here even had 2 pathways within it. Then we had a single accelerated. Those would be the kids taking algebra in 8th grade. That's a large group of kids in our district, as well as then the twice accelerated sequence. That's a much smaller group of kids that actually take pre-algebra in 6th grade. Then by 7th grade, they're taking algebra 1. And so this is what we've had for as long as I've been in the district, which I think started in 2002. And this is where we are at now. Essentially, we have just eliminated all of the courses that would be considered below grade level or like that didn't meet the expectations of the Iowa core. Essentially, we don't have those courses anymore. Instead, we have sort of a high rigor, high expectation with high help model. And that's where we are today. You can see one of the changes here is we have this Thinking Mathematically Support course. Michelle's going to talk about another support course we have. And really there have been no changes to our single accelerated sequence, as well as we've had no changes to our twice accelerated sequence. But over here, in our regularly paced sequence, there's just one option now, and then we don't have any of those below level choices. So I probably explained, so here's just another way to look at it because those last slides were so blurry. This is where we're at now. 7th grade, for the majority of our students in our regular pathway, 7th grade math, pre-algebra in 8th grade, algebra 1, which really is sort of nationally recognized as 9th grade math, geometry, algebra 2, and then some choices, right? You could do pre-calculus, there's classes at Kirkwood, there's stats classes, things like that. We also have a couple options of maybe what we used to be. Now remember, there were at least, I don't know, were there 6, 7, 8 options before? But in the past, even starting in Math 7 and Pre-Al 8, so starting on the regular pathway, we haven't had below-level courses in our junior highs for several years now. But depending on how you did in 8th grade math, you could have bumped all the way back to math skills, which often was teaching 5th, 6th grade standards to students if we're talking about what are our Iowa core standards for math. Another sequence that maybe could have been considered, I didn't circle it in red earlier, could have been considered grade level was this Algebra 1A, Algebra 1B. We just took Algebra 1 and kind of slowed it down. So they were getting access to high school standards, but taking 2 years to do the Algebra ones. So that's just, if that's easier to see. another option. So, sort of summarizing that, what we did is we removed courses that would be considered below grade level. It's as simple as that. We build in support courses for students. And I think like the monumentous thing that has happened in our district is we have set all students in our high schools on a trajectory to complete at least Algebra 2. As they enter our high schools, that's where they're going to start, is with the potential to complete Algebra 2. So it's a big shift, and it's a significant one. And if you asked me to summarize in one sentence what we've done in our math programming, it would be the first point here, which is that we have created greater equity in our math courses. It's the most important thing in my book. It doesn't cost us anything in terms of rigor for all students. And it, to me, feels like a moral imperative for our district to have done this work. And the other, I think, maybe harder to describe thing, if you had a chance to peek at that chapter from the book, this is mentioned in there as well. But what we've done is we've shifted. We've always provided access to high quality math, and maybe not high quality, but high level, high rigor, levels of rigor. But now instead of saying, well, you have the option to get there, now we're saying, as a district, we're going to guarantee that our students get access to high levels of math learning. I think these bottom two things are, sometimes when you say unintended consequences, that sounds bad. I would say they're actually positive consequences that we weren't setting out or looking for. But one is there's just a high level of collaboration. If we go back here, it's hard to collaborate when people are teaching so many courses. It's just the truth. To find a prep period in your building that aligns with someone else teaching your class, we're going to put a heavy load on teachers to ask them to do that. But in this you can see we have a huge number, especially of Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2 teachers, and it opens the door. Uh-oh, Nick, are we out of clicker? There we go. It opens the door for more collaboration, which I'm hopeful is going to just lead. I've even seen glimpses of this already in just 9 weeks of higher collective teacher efficacy. Meaning our teachers are working together and they know that working together they can be really effective in their classrooms. We didn't set out to do that, but I think it's something that is already starting to show up. The other piece here that I think is notable, though not maybe a reason to do this work, is that in the state of Iowa, I get calls once a month, if not more often, from Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, College Community. Hey, what's Iowa City doing, right? People are looking to Iowa City. We know that this work should be done because the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics has recommended it. National Council for Supervisors of Mathematics has recommended detracking math in our secondary schools. And other people know it too. They call us to see what we're doing. And so it's fun to be able to finally this year say, like, well, we're starting. We're going down that pathway. Also, our colleagues at the AEA have shared that often the districts around us will use Iowa City as an example. Like, well, Iowa City's still offering math skills. Iowa City still has this below-level course. Why would you recommend that we get rid of it? And so I think, though that's not our goal here, right? I don't think it's a bad thing at all to be a leader. So that's kind of what we've done, where we're at. The next thing
Heidi, can I just interject with one thing?
Yeah.
So just one thing to anchor this back. Remember, we shared a lot of data. It was probably like 3 years ago already when we started some of this conversation, this work, and shared a lot of data. And Heidi did a great job of sharing that equity lens, for this work. And I would say just, one of my first experiences in the district was principal at Southeast Junior High and walking down the hallways and seeing our different math classes. And you walk by a Math 7A classroom at that time, who was in there? It was all of our black students, right? All of our black and brown students. And I think that was the impetus to talk about, okay, what do we do with junior high courses? And then when we ran the data and looked at our high school courses, it's the same thing. When she was showing those lower level progressions, it was really an equity issue for us. And it should be one of those like pit in your stomach moments, right? That if we know that all of our black and brown students are in lower level courses, we have a responsibility to do something about that, right? And to act with that. And so as she talks about, some of the things here that we go through with early successes and challenges that'll still be in front and things and support that we need to provide the teachers, those are things we need to try to figure out, right, that we have to do, because just continuing with that model, we can talk all we want about achievement gap and all of those things, but if we never talk about the access gap and figuring out how we increase that access to that grade level content, we're going to keep seeing the same results. So just kind of anchoring back to the origination of that change, right, it was rooted in data. We knew who were in those lower level courses, and we can't just continue with that model. So anyways, I just wanted to go back to that point about what started the conversation to where we got today. So
Can I just throw some numbers, because I was just looking it up. So
thank you.
in 1920, our population of students, 60% were white, so 40% were non-white. But in math skills, 87% were non-white.
2020.
No, 19.
Oh,
19.
God, I'm like,
Listen, I did the same thing.
you're going way.
No, I was like, that data seems to not be relevant.
It was only
Yeah.
60%
Wow.
white.
We're back in the last pandemic. Sorry, 2019, 2020.
I've been talking
I
about
was just
Bessie
looking
Coleman all
at
day.
this. Yeah. So anyway, back to,
Okay.
40% of our students are non-white, right, at that point. But 87% in math skills were non-white.
Okay.
And then 80% in intro to Alg, and then 70% in Alj 1A and 1B are non-white. So that just shows you how black and brown those classes are. Yep.
And the same is true on the other end, that
Yes, I could do that too.
we
Yep.
disproportionately identify white students for our accelerated and advanced courses
White
too.
Asian. Mhm.
So I'm sorry, Diane, those numbers are from what year?
Sorry, 2019 to 2020.
Okay, so recent.
I didn't pull them from last year.
That's all right, okay, so very recent. Okay.
Yes. Mhm.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's great. I have the same information here. So I think when you see that, it,
Oh,
like
I'm
Matt
sorry, I
said,
didn't know you did.
I don't have it on the
Okay.
slides. In my chicken scratches here. In case we had questions about that. I think it's compelling, right, when we see that data. So some of our early successes, the systematic change, the number of students. One piece of data that we were not able to get concretely is last year to this year, how many students did we have in below level courses? We found we had some numbers pulled, but they don't look good, so we're not going to share them because I don't want to misrepresent the truth. But it's for sure hundreds of students a year ago were in below level courses that now there's no below level courses for them to go in. We've built these 2 support courses that we'll hear about one of them today, Sheltered ELL Algebra 1, and then Thinking Mathematically is the other support course. We have some early student achievement data that in terms of like our failing students at midterm, we have one of our high schools, 6% of students in Algebra 1. It's actually less than, Nick shared with me before the meeting, less than the number of students failing in geometry. Up to our highest is 18% of the students failing Algebra 1 in one of our schools. And if we think of like an MTSS model, right, of ways to support students, in my head, I'm always kind of thinking about 20%. We want our core to meet the needs of like, I guess 80%, right? And so if we're under 20% here, we can, I don't want 18% of kids to fail, but we can start building some supports in there to hopefully lower that number as we go. So we'd love to say 0% of our students are failing Algebra 1 right now, but to consider that many of our students wouldn't even have been getting access to high school level or grade level standards, this feels like a huge win. And then again, the collaboration piece has just become essential, and I just think teachers need that. Like even on a personal level for teachers, having some partners in the work with you is just really important. So we have 2 teachers here, and I think I'm going to ask Michelle just to share for a couple minutes. She teaches a sheltered Algebra 1. So what that means is, and I have done a lot of learning. This is my 2nd year in the position, so last year especially I learned a lot about sheltered classes. And what it is for our very beginning students, so our students who come to our school district as level 1 ELL beginners, so brand new English speakers, we build literally what it sounds like, a sheltered course for them, and it's co-taught between a math and an EL teacher. So Michelle, do you want to just share a little bit about how that's going and the significance of it?
Yep. This is my first year with the sheltered ELL class, but in the past, for the past half a decade, I've had experience with the 1As, and so that was a normal class for me also. And I could see every one of my sheltered kids from this year being placed in one of those 1A classes. And so that's, I think, where they would have been had we, kept the 1A, the 1B, and the classes along the way. The difference with them, though, is that our sheltered class, in an ideal situation this year. I've only got 11 kids in there, and it's a co-taught course with another ELL teacher. And so I can really cover the math content, and we can go through materials, and then he really covers the language. And so we have a nice setup where we can kind of divide and conquer, and it's almost like the plan is in the future to have it more of like a blended learning kind of a thing, where we can work in stations and we can work on math content, we can work on vocabulary, we can work on reteaching, and even the accelerated stuff, because they are at different levels coming in. Some of those kiddos have never been to school before, and then some of them come in with some experience and transcripts, and we know a little bit more about them. But in the regular 1A, if we would still have 1A, if I would put my 11 kids in that class, just based on who was in there, and it's a 1A algebra class of 30 kids, and they're all mixed and blended abilities. But the ELL ones who I've had in the past tend to be very, very reserved and quiet and kind of hide in the back. And so when you've got 30 kids in there, the ELL ones kind of, because they're so, you know, passive almost a little bit, you know, they hide very, very well. And it's one of those coping things, and it's not always good for them. So this sheltered class, what we have is, I mean, they're all beginner ELLs, and there's a small group of them. And there are so many languages that kind of happen all at the same time. So I've got Spanish and French in my room, and really it will be like I will teach a lesson in English, and then Mr. Daniel, who is my co-teacher, he can look around and see, you know, if light bulbs are happening or not, and if they're not, he will kind of go through it in French. And so I'm very, very, I'm at an advantage to have him in there, and I love that. We do a lot of our YouTube video resources, whatever it is that we can find in foreign languages for them, because we can present it to all of them at the same time, which is really nice. Or, let's see, what else do we do? I teach in English, he teaches in French and Spanish, and really they talk to each other too. This is probably what I love more than anything, is that the ELL kiddos that I have this year, if they were in a regular gen ed class or the 1A, they would sit back and they would listen, and they are fantastic listeners, but you can only kind of soak in so much. But when we have them kind of in a group all on their own, they debate with each other. And whether it's vocabulary or content or whatever it is, they will go up to the board and they talk to each other, and then they work together and help each other out. And nobody's really shy. Like, nobody has to be really shy and sit back in those classes. And they are doing fantastic. So we're doing the same Algebra 1 content. So if it was math skills or 1A, we would be just at a different pace. But because it's a small group, and because they're willing to talk and they're willing to ask questions, just comfort-wise, like who's in the room, they are doing amazing. So
And this experience is different than you were seeing in prior years, is that right?
Yep, so I've had 1A before, and I've done 1A co-taught and not co-taught. And so normally it's a larger group.
Okay.
And so, and the number of students always kind of matters, and how much you have to differentiate matters also. I mean, there's always big differences in those classes. But when you take out a lot of the behavior things, and you take out more of the attention seeking, and the kids are building relationships just because they're smaller groups and because they all have that same level 1 ELL. So it's not even like the level 2s and the level 3s. It's the beginner ELLs.
Okay.
So if they're building relationships in school, they're doing a really good job in that class at least.
Okay, thanks.
So.
Thank you.
Around our sheltered course, one thing that I think is remarkable, we have 65 students that would be considered beginners, or occasionally there's a student that the level is called an intermediate 1. They're just beyond beginner, but they're not quite ready to jump out into the general population of English-speaking students. Of our 65 students at our 3 comprehensive high schools, we only have 1 student at midterm that had a failing grade in that. It is likely that if those students were in, like, for example, a regular Algebra 1, that the majority of our students would not be passing that class. And it's been a huge lift on a lot of principals to organize their schedules, structure their schedules so that they can have an EL teacher and a math teacher in the room together. Guidance counselors have probably faced bigger scheduling challenges than ever this year, but we've just had a lot of people say we're committed to this and we're gonna make this work. And so I'll just be honest, the first time I went in Michelle's room this year, I got a little teary seeing it actually, because I knew what would have been the case for many of those students, that they just wouldn't have spoken up for themselves in that class. I watched a young man argue with Michelle in a good way about I want kids arguing about their math, okay? Because he thought she had a plus sign on the board, and it was actually division, and it just was a little blurry, and he got the wrong answer. And I was just like, oh my goodness, this is so cool. We've got kids actually arguing about their math with their teacher in a good way. So that was really fun to see.
So Matt, did we change the number of teachers?
Well, I think it goes back to what Heidi was talking about with the collaboration component, when you had all of those different courses that we were teaching, and then teachers would need to be assigned to those different courses, right?
So basically
of
the
course
same
there's
number
more-
of teachers are teaching
Yeah, there's more.
somewhat fewer
Yeah.
courses. And
Yeah, so
Is
we
that-
have more Algebra 1 teachers now, right? Because there's
Okay.
fewer teachers teaching those other courses because we're not offering those, so now they're together there. And we did do some things with those ESSER dollars, as we've talked about different times, to increase our math staffing, language arts staffing, and some of those components.
Yeah, we had, it was one at each high school was added, a math teacher at each high school, so that would have, had some positive impact.
it
on
would have
us.
had an impact, but that's not the kind of change that you're talking about, right? One teacher in your high school, one additional teacher in your high school would not have produced this change in
This
methods.
is only it's one section here at Liberty of the sheltered course. So Michelle just teaches one of those.
Okay.
It's currently 2 at City High, and we're hoping, I see Mitch in here, we're hoping we'll be able to move some things around and make it 2. It's currently 1 at West High as well, one section.
So Charlie, when you think about that, like a full FTE, the space it gives you in a secondary schedule to create how many more sections, right? So we think about that teacher and then all of the preps that they can now basically teach. It frees up opportunities like this for another teacher to do
Okay.
the EL sheltered, right? Because we have more sections we can offer in that content area.
Okay.
And for a class to be sheltered, like Michelle's a good example. She has actually a math and an EL endorsement, so she could do that alone. But we've collaborated a lot with our EL team, and they have just said for the first time that we do this, we don't want to just say we're doing it and put a math teacher in there without the EL teacher that can provide such valuable language support. And so all of our buildings actually were able to also free up an EL teacher to be a co-teacher in all of those classes.
And I guess a related question, has the number of students changed in this, in the math curriculum?
Well, so again, that's kind of back to, we're serving whatever number of students we have on our campuses, right? But
Okay.
how are we serving them, in which course are we serving them, right?
But the same number of students are still taking math. Is that
Right, the same number of
Yes.
students are going to take math, but
Right,
now what
okay.
course are they taking
Right,
in math,
right.
right? And then remember, this is ELO students for this one particular section we're talking about, but otherwise, the grade level standard now is Algebra 1 for the ninth grade students, right?
Okay.
So, and Heidi alluded to at one point, which I know we'll talk about, is a continual work in progress for, right, is that continuum of learners now is larger too, right? So when you think about those rates she talked around failures, that's actually astronomically low, because I bet if we went and looked at Algebra 1A, math skills, and looked at those failure rates, you'd have just as much or more than what we're seeing in those failure rates now. So I think there's a lot of positives to point from. Are there still some things, as I'm sure we're going to talk about, where we have to, continue to provide support? Yes, there are, but those are just another couple of contextual things to point out.
I was going to ask that if we do a trimester dive into data and final fill rates, if we could find the fail rates, but then compare them
Yeah, do
to the
that
fail
comparison,
rates
yeah.
for math skills, intro to algebra, and algebra 1, I'd be very interested in seeing not just percentages, but total students too. Because, if you've got 30% of kids failing algebra 1A, intro to Al, and math skills, all of those, is that the same
Right,
as
it's like the cumulative percentage
16%
for the
of
algebra.
this one class? I'd be interested in that. And then, are there plans to do, I'm a little rusty with ELL, are there plans to do a sheltered, geometry class for these kids next year, or after a full year of high school here, they're not EL1 students anymore, they move up to EL2?
So likely, hopefully that's the case, that this group of students won't need a sheltered course a year
Yeah.
from now. That's not to say that we couldn't get a beginner student who needed a sheltered geometry class. So it's on the table as future work, but it wouldn't likely be this same group of students. It would more be a new coming student to our district, which there's some tricky things with that, depending on what kind of transcripts they bring. Often students are coming to us from an integrated math, which is different than the approach we have, which is Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2. An integrated math is more like our elementary, where the geometry is part of the 9th grade, they call it Math 1 or Integrated Math 1, and that's what a lot of the international community does. And so there's some tricky things about identifying what math course do students need. What the language is actually more clear, I think, and more cut and dry in terms of determining what their level of language proficiency is. I think if our EL coordinators were here, they would say, looking at the numbers of students, how many beginning students that also qualified for geometry, if that number, for example, were larger than the number of students that needed Algebra 1 that were beginners, then we would do this model in geometry. Of course, in a perfect world, I'd love to have all of those things going, right? So we have Emily here, and I do want to talk just about Algebra 1, which is now our, I would say, commonplace, or our beginning 9th grade course. So Emily it's actually her first year teaching Algebra 1, and I will say, it's pretty awesome, some of the stuff she's doing. So I guess the first thing we're going to ask you to speak on are, what are some things you've noticed just about the class as a whole, putting students who maybe typically wouldn't have qualified for Algebra 1 historically into that class? What do you see in those students?
Well, I think one of the, so we have an Algebra 1 PLC, all the teachers talk together, and one of the things that came out at our first meeting when we talked was just the amount of kids buying in, getting to work and showing, positive student habits. When you have everyone in the same class, kids that might not act away with other friends or whatever, act like everyone else in the class. So because there's positive role models, kids that might have been in our lower level classes who might have acted a different way are acting more like the rest of their peers. So engagement on math topics and activities has been up compared to lower level math classes, just because you have those positive role models in the classroom.
And then the other thing I wanted to hear about from you was, tell us about a student or two that has been really successful in algebra this year.
So one thing that did come up after me and Heidi already talked, I'm thinking of, I also teach a sheltered EL class, and I was thinking about thinking mathematically. That's the other support class, and how helpful that was or is for our lower level kids. I'm sorry, I'm an emotional person, so I'm just thinking about this kid and how much that class has helped her. I mean, she's in a sheltered class anyways, so she already gets a lot of support. And her confidence, just a few days after I had talked about a topic, because she had gotten a different course and then my course, and she had been talking about it for 2 days, confidence and proficiency was amazing. And every kid that I have that's coming from thinking mathematically has been so good, so fabulous, and I really do enjoy that course. The other thing that I had already thought about was we just had conferences. And so I was talking to a parent, and she was commenting that she was so worried, when they had taken away the lower level classes, her kid had traditionally struggled. And so she was thinking that Algebra 1 is going to be a lot. And she has really flourished. The ability for her to see that grade level material and keep up with everyone else, has given her confidence, and she's actually doing really well. She has a B, and that's great. And then the real success story is my colleague Barb has a kid that was actually placed in my ELL class to start with. But he passed into intermediate, he was an intermediate person, like maybe 5 days into the try. So we took him to the regular Algebra 1 because we have a few too many kids in my EL class. It's not quite the 11. But he was in sheltered to begin with last year. And she said like he struggled through it and he was working really hard. And he's in regular Algebra 1 and he has an A. He's in a class that has like, I think 60% IEPs and ELs. So it's like a pretty heavy packed class, but he's doing so well. He has co-teacher with that class and he's been able to flourish and, you know, go from a 5th and 6th grade level to a 9th grade level with all that support. So those are some of the successes. I'm sorry.
It's
No,
powerful.
it's
to
fine.
see.
Really, don't be sorry.
Don't be sorry.
It's,
Yeah, and thank you guys both. Like, we just appreciate the work you're doing, and I just can't say enough. It's not a light lift for anyone. This has been a heavy lift, and people are really getting after it, and it's exciting. So the last thing we're going to do is just touch on some of the ongoing work, and a big one is professional development for teachers. I'll talk about that a little bit more. There's still some work to be done in our progressions. I don't think it's perfect yet. And then also encouraging students. That's just one question we want to think about. Like, what could we do like to make math the best part of kids' day, to get kids taking 4 years of math instead of the required 3? So professional learning, these are sort of the big things we're focusing on. One is just grade level standards. It's just really important if we are going to provide rigorous high level access, we need to know what those are. And most of us in our career have probably relied on our instructional materials, and they often are a great starting place, but we need to really look and know, like, okay, this thing, that's a 7th grade standard, so I don't want to spend a week on that, for example. If my kids need a review, especially like if a certain group of kids need a review, I might bring that small group of kids in. I'll work with them to get this 7th or 8th grade thing that they need to learn to be able to access the 9th grade thing. And so there's a couple pieces, really knowing what are the standards that are aligned with each of our high school courses, as well as what are the leading standards, we could call them prerequisite skills or standards that kids need to access that 9th grade material. Often we'll talk about math being sequential. It is and it isn't, right? There's places that math is sequential, but it's not like all of math is sequential for all of high school. So long division is a classic example. That's a 5th grade standard about. And there are places in high school math dividing polynomials. You need to know how to do long division, right? But if you can't do long division, you could do everything else in the Algebra 1 standards except for dividing polynomials. I don't want to make you spend a whole year of your math education working on below level standards just so that you learn to do long division. If that's like as simplified as I could make that. So certainly there are places where math is sequential. You have to know thing A to do thing B, but it's not like the entirety of math is that way. And we just need, every teacher needs more time working in and talking about and understanding their standards. Equitable teaching practices is the other thing. If we continue to teach, let's see, this week in some of the podcasts I listened to, I heard sit and get is like how math has been described, or chalk and talk is another method that I heard about math just this week. If we continue to teach math the same way that most of us in this room grew up learning math, some of these initiatives, and I don't even like the word initiative, but some of our students actually won't be successful. We need to grow in what are equitable math teaching practices. The interesting thing is that as we as teachers dive into those things, sometimes they're actually a little bit lighter lift on the teacher, and they're definitely more fun, right? And if I think there's anything teachers and kids need right now, it's to be having fun in their classroom. I mean, that's just the truth, right? And so exploring, like, what are those equitable practices, just getting some exposure with them. Okay, now let's go out in our classrooms and practice them. Let's watch our colleague and then talk about what went well, And we just need to spend more time doing that. And then I almost hesitated. Differentiation and equitable teaching practices could almost be interchangeable. What I'm not suggesting with differentiation is that if I have 13 people in the room or whatever it is, that every one of you gets a different lesson, right? But it might mean something like a math problem that we would call a low floor, high ceiling, right? It's a problem that a student with a low level of readiness could access, but also a student who's incredibly accelerated, or maybe even the math teacher, could also contribute at a different level. There's a problem that has kind of circled around the math community, and it's a system of equations. And so for me, when I sat down to do that problem, I wrote out this very complex 6-equation system of equations. And if I had even one error in there, I would have just ruined the whole thing. And then I had a 12-year-old at Southeast Junior High go up to the board and just start crossing stuff off, and did it in about a minute. And that's an example where he and I have different levels of like readiness, and his lower level of readiness actually was an asset to my classroom, that my like algebraic knowledge got in the way of my mathematical thinking. So we just want to keep working around that. And differentiation still includes things like small group instruction and some of that, very similar to what we'd be familiar with in the elementary classrooms, but that's not the whole gist of it at the secondary level. Junior high math progress. I just think we need to keep talking about this. One thing we're seeing is so currently in our junior highs we have a grade level course, and then we have an accelerated course. We're identifying 40-some, I'm sorry I don't have this number right off the top of my head, I think it's 44% of our students that we identify for the once accelerated pathway, meaning they take pre-algebra in 7th grade, algebra in 8th grade, and the demographics of that class are very different from the demographics of the students that we have in our grade level courses. So even though we've removed the lowest courses, I still don't think we've entirely solved that problem, and I think we need to keep having that conversation. What is the most equitable practice we can have in our junior highs? I don't know the answer to that. That's why it's an ongoing work. We need to keep working on that. And then this mention here about acceleration leading to significant numbers of students not taking math their senior year in high school. We, just out of curiosity, we started looking at that data, and I need to find my sticky note here. So I had our data guy, our data analyst, pulled our current seniors that were in a pathway to take calculus by their senior year, okay? So in 8th grade, there were 349 of those students that are still in our district today. Only 159 of those students are still taking calculus A, B, or BC, which are the 2 calculuses we offer. So that's 46% of the kids. The question was brought up to me, oh, they're probably all going to Kirkwood or the University of Iowa, right? But we have 11 students right now in our district that are taking advantage of that. So that doesn't bring us to, that would bring us to, let's see, 170 out of 349. So that's 49% of our students. It's still not even half of the kids. I'm not saying we shouldn't accelerate. I'm saying we should talk about, is this best serving our kids? And do we agree with this? Is it the right thing? Why is this happening? I mean, we just haven't even, we've had a big lift this year. We haven't even started on that pathway of asking those questions, like what's going on here? But I think that's a good next step for us.
So you're saying you asked those questions this year, and we have not been asking them in previous years?
I think we've known the data, Charlie. Some of that is, we look at that data when we look at what that early acceleration leads to, and so Heidi or even the past curriculum coordinator, we've seen that before and known that there's that kind of that void in that senior year experience. And I think that's the question Heidi's really prompting is like, okay, what happens to the students when they don't take a senior year math because of acceleration potentially, and then how are we setting them up for success potentially in their college experience if they're doing that? So if they accelerate quickly, exhaust the math sequence, only are required to do the 3, complete that their junior year and stay away from math their senior year, that can have consequences even for those accelerated kids, right? I think like what she's saying is, I don't think we want to put too many value judgments on it until we can look at it more and at least have the conversation to say, okay, what's this tell us? And, how's that going to affect their experience potentially?
I was just saying, I think about it through the STEM lens as well, and even way back when I graduated from high school, I was intent upon getting my 3 years of math in A lot of my friends took that Math 4 class in senior year. I took a Quant 1 class at Iowa. I was so far in over my head because I sat a year out. And I think the hard thing is not only do you have the acceleration piece, but we have a 4.33 requirement. ELA is required of 4 years of credit, but math we're cut off at 3. And so I think that's the tricky thing, is how do you get kids interested and excited to stay in that class that last year when, like myself, I was trying to protect my GPA. I was not smart on my part.
Was that in 1920?
Well,
I was about 19.
I think too, when I say like I don't doubt for a minute that the admin at the district level has been looking at that. I'm also just starting my second year in this position, so I hadn't looked at that information
Okay.
before. So I think sometimes I could maybe sell the team short because I'm the latecomer to the team. I'm learning this as we go.
Well, I could give you anecdotal evidence. I'm one of those this is very familiar to what it was like when I was in school some time ago. I was on pace to take calculus in my senior year, and I just didn't want to.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated from college with a math minor and took multivariable calculus. I took a lot of math classes, so I took a year off and went right back to it. So I don't know that it necessarily says that people just stop and then never go back to it. Then I'm 80 down points in
Yeah.
the
But
other
I think
direction.
part of what I was, like, and we're gonna get to this on the next slide, is, also just thinking about what are our offerings? What are the things, because for some students, they may not wanna take calculus, right? So what is an appealing option that could be something for kids to consider? What are some things that, so it's an ongoing dialogue there, but I think our sentiments, at least as Heidi and I have been working on this a little bit, is we don't know that generally speaking, having that gap there, if your pathway is maybe to go to a college or university, is a positive thing. So we want to look at what are some things that sets kids up for success. And some other pieces with this that we're going to think about too is, now that we have all these students in algebra, it's roughly a little over 900 in the ninth grade in our high schools. Okay, well, what does their 3 and 4 year experience look like? We know what geometry is going to look like next year, but then what does that continue to look like? So that's where it's more of just what's that ongoing conversation for all students? What are we doing to keep our our seniors involved or whatever it may be?
Can you tell me how students identify to be accelerated?
So there's two different sort of levels of acceleration. One is a very small group of kids that we test as 5th graders. We test the 98th and 99th percentile in math to take pre-algebra, which is 8th grade math, as 6th graders. Currently there's 17 of those kids that are 17 of those 6th graders right now.
In the whole district?
Mm-hmm. It's a twice accelerated group.
That's super accelerated. Pre-algebra in 6th grade.
But that's a small number of kids, too.
I know that.
And then
We serve them in our, it's actually a benefit of the online, we serve them through the online program, so they actually participate with other students of different ages now, so that's actually been instead of having to drive them all over, just a little side fun fact.
Okay.
That's fascinating.
And then our single accelerated, so the majority of the kids who accelerate, it's 44% of our student body. They take a test at the end of 6th grade. We're going to explore some other options simply because we're spending a lot of time testing kids, and what we find in the junior highs is our test isn't placing students very accurately. Teachers are having to do a lot of formative assessment, trying to figure out what's going on here. It just hasn't been, at least in my experience last year doing this, and also as a junior high teacher prior to that, it hasn't been a great system, and so that's something we're really looking to figure out, maybe a new pathway to figure that out.
And then looking at the sequence chart, if you're accelerated, I see when you hit high school, it's geometry honors, algebra 2 honors.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a 9th grader in geometry honors, you're not in a similar class with sophomores who are on the regular track taking geometry. It's
Right.
it's a separate
separate
9th
class.
grade honors class.
Yes.
Okay.
There could be sophomores in geometry honors if they had done exceptionally well in their algebra 1 class. Yes, thank you, Emily.
So that they kind of jump off the regular track onto an honors track. And
Michelle is actually teaching, I believe, both of those, geometry and geometry
Yep.
honors.
And this year I've actually got 2, and just because of scheduling, Our geometry honors classes are in the afternoons, at middle of the day, to even afternoons, and the young ladies go to North Central, and they can't get here in the middle of the day, and they don't want to be online. And so they're actually in my first hour geometry classes, and so they'll do the regular geometry route this year, even as an 8th grader, but then next year they'll still get placed in the Algebra 2 honors, if they choose to.
And just to clarify too, a couple of years ago, the state made us award high school credit for any student taking a high school course in junior high. So technically, if a student took Algebra 1 as a 7th grader and then geometry, they could take a freshman year, Alg 2, and be done, because they would have their 3 years of math.
Yes, thank you. Michelle has to go pick up little ones.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you,
Thank you
Michelle.
so much.
One other maybe dot I want to connect here, and I hope this is okay that I do it, and then I do have one last slide, is that,
Do you mind if I add something? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I just wanted to say that my son is one of those twice accelerated students, and he's one of the seniors that's not taking a
Yeah.
math class, and it's because he was going to take a university class of linear algebra, but it was immediately after school, and so he wouldn't be able to go out for cross country.
Oh.
And then he tried to take stats, but it just wouldn't fit into his schedule, and so he has an open period, and honestly, he really appreciates that.
Yeah.
Because his whole high school career, he's just been really, at it with the books, with these very high level classes.
Yeah.
And this allows him to take a few classes that he might not otherwise take, psychology and journalism.
Mhm.
And so to sort of expand his breadth, it's not all these STEM classes. So
Yeah.
I guess, my perspective is that I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if they're not taking that accelerated math their 4th year.
Yeah,
It's worked out for him.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Obviously when we're pulling this, we're looking at it from the 10,000-foot lens, right? And we're looking at big trends we see in our kids. But I do think there are examples, and I think maybe, I don't know if it's a balance, right, in our system, what we're doing. How do we serve the system as a whole while still meeting the needs of those individual kids? And that's just a challenge, right? So I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
I just wanted to give you that feedback.
Thank you.
Well, I think part of our job, right, is just making sure students make an informed decision around it, right? And they're making the decision that's best for them. Like
Yeah.
Sean said, there's a number of examples where kids will come back to it, right? It's not that they're going to be done forever, and so just that they're making an informed decision about what the trade-off is. Jane's experience with her own student, that could be best. What's best for that one. There could be a different solution that's best for another student. So I think that's why we paint it as just continuing the conversation, knowing that, hey, this is out there, but then what do we do about it, and what is the solution? There's no predetermined solution on it yet, but just having the conversation.
Yeah. The last sort of conversation that we think needs to be happening is those 3rd and 4th year options for kids, so that there are more options. Because I'm guessing most of us in this room, the offerings in high school math today are pretty similar to the offerings that existed in high school math when we went to school. And yet, think of the world around us, right? I think there were cell phones right as I was finishing high school. And things have changed. And so what do we need to be doing in our district sort of to keep up with the times, right? I don't know another way to say it. There's a book that came out in September called Reinvigorating High School Math. I don't have my hands on it yet, but I've listened to a couple podcasts around it, and they suggest things like a more robust financial literacy course that actually aligns to some of the Algebra 2 standards. Currently, financial literacy is taught in our social studies, right, Brady?
And business.
Or business, okay. Yeah, and then there's like a data and stats class. That's really an important part of today's world that maybe didn't exist there. There's some other options. We have some constraints around the Iowa core, too. Those courses would need to be aligned with the Algebra 2 standards. And so it's really, I need to read more, learn sort of what is the predominant thinking around this. So that is where we're at. I will do my best to entertain any questions. I know we've kind of had a dialogue right now, but.
I'm curious too, the thinking mathematically support class, does that count as a year of math? Okay.
It's
so
elective math credit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't count towards one of the 3.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's designed to be a companion or a concurrent course to Algebra 1, I don't think it would absolutely have to be. Because we really, yes, there is some, I would say, like pre-teaching, building up those foundational skills, but what we know is a lot of kids can't sustain more than 20 minutes of really hands-on digging into the math content anyway. And so we've built in a lot of like learning how to be a good math student, how to take risks, how to reason abstractly and quantitatively, right? All of these math practices that some kids come to us already having, some kids have watched their parents do it, whatever the reason may be, building up those skills in kids that can help them then go back to their Algebra 1 class and be successful. I think the power of those types of skills are so important that even if you were in a geometry class, I think hearing that part of the course would be really beneficial for a student.
And then the regularly paced Algebra 1, have we changed the standards for that class now that we are adding a lot of new people in it?
We have not changed the standards for that class, and I think that's a really important point, right, is that it only works if we keep the rigor high, right? Like if we start lowering the standard, then what happens is we've recreated these below level tracks, I would call them, with a new name, right? And so it's why we keep doing that work, because on the standards work, right? We do it, the math teachers are probably sick of me, but we keep doing that standards work to keep looking like, what is the standard? Even interpreting it. Oftentimes there's a standard, we could read the math standard and, you know, Emily and I might interpret that totally differently. And so there's some resources from NCTM and different organizations that show us, like, what does this look like at a high school level? This isn't the 8th grade version of that standard. Sometimes we have to build up those 8th grade skills to get to that high school standard, but the goal is absolutely high school standards in Algebra 1. It has to be, yeah.
Heidi, you want to go back to your math is not necessarily a succession of steps that you have to go through.
Yeah.
And when you hit your limit, that's it for you. You're not going any higher. As I understand it, the way we got to this first slide that you showed, Program of Studies for 2021,
Mm-hmm.
and do I understand this correctly, Matt? This is where we were before this year in terms of what courses kids took in mathematics. Is that right?
Yeah, we had several, you know, of these lower level courses, basically,
Okay,
Charlie.
okay.
Instead of the grade level course of
Okay.
Algebra 1, there was these other
And
offerings.
the reason we were having kids do the lower level courses, what are they called, slower paced, whatever, was because the assumption was that the kids in those courses had reached the end of their sequence.
Yeah, I don't know if it's about the end of their sequence, but I think part of it's about solving the challenge differently, right? And so Heidi talked about a couple times.
And I think that's what Heidi is saying, is that my understanding of why there's math tracking is wrong.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the problem, is we know better now, and so we have to do better, right? And so we
Right.
know that if we put them in tracks, what never happens is the gap closes. They never get to the skills they need to
Right.
have. They never get to the standards they need to have.
Right.
And so we can't continue to spend 2 and 3 years of trying to backfill holes that students have in their knowledge without giving them access to what the grade level standard is. And so the new challenge is, right, they're all in that class together, then how do we provide support to those students to be able to differentiate the curriculum like she talked about? That's the ongoing support we have to provide to the staff about that game is different now, right? The challenge is different now with all of those learners in there. But we know the results of doing it the other way, right? We have tons of data on doing it the other way and what our data looks like and where those students end up when they don't get access to 3 years of high quality math and what the results of that are. And so that's the part about, okay, you make the change, now what has to come along with the change? And the part I loved, from hearing from our teacher down there is so many of these kids come in with a preconceived notion about what their math experience has been. And whether it's that thinking mathematically class, or whether it's the sheltered course, or whether it's their experience in algebra, and just like she said about trying to go along with the flow basically of what the other students are doing, it's about confidence, right? I mean, a lot of them in some of these lower level courses that we were continuing to offer, I mean, their math confidence was shaken to the core, right? I mean, they already told themselves a story about what kind of math student they were. This gives them an opportunity to tell a different story to
And the
themselves.
story
about what
was
they
not
can do.
right.
Yeah, and the story was not right, exactly.
Yeah.
and I'd add a very practical piece of, in a couple of those pathways, we're making decisions for 14 and 15-year-old kids that are later than impacting their ability to go to, the University of Iowa to participate. I mean,
It's a life decision.
Yeah.
I mean, it has huge implications there. So, where kids are getting, we're placing some of those. So I think that's a very practical aspect of this too.
So I want to go back to, I'm still trying to understand what happens in classrooms, which frankly is a real struggle for me. So you said in your, I'm sorry, the other person.
Emily.
Emily, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Emily. You said that you've seen, basically I guess what I understand you're saying is that you don't mind kids being in your classroom who don't quite understand what you're trying to teach. And you're not saying that they don't understand it because they didn't learn it last year or year before or year before.
I'm saying that their study skills are improving. I think there are still some big gaps and some real challenges. I think we're doing a lot to try to, in my own experience, I was a person that wasn't accelerated until high school. And so me getting confidence was later. Me clicking, math clicking was later. But I do think that there are some serious issues that we need to think about. Like, I have kids in my class that have failed 2 years in a row and are in Algebra 1. And I worry about their mental health. I worry about this struggle for them if it's too much, because there is a breaking point. But providing extra help can help. So
you don't want to go back to that with those kids?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think we're still getting used to it, right? I'm not sure the student I'm talking about right now, when I'm thinking of it, she has a lot of gaps to fill. And I don't know if there is a level of gap that you can't do it with this model. Like, we haven't had enough time. So I'm having a hard time deciding yet at this point, but I don't think you can say that everything before high school didn't matter. And I've also noticed it with my ELs, like, it's hard for me to say that they're going to be fine when they haven't had a normal schooling background. Like, when multiplication is tough, I don't know how factoring is going to go. But we're not there yet, so I'm still along for the ride, so we'll try to plug what we can plug right now, but I think there's a lot of gap. We've had 9 weeks, so 9 weeks is hard for me to say. Me as a math person, it kind of makes me uncomfortable saying that we're going to be able to plug all the holes just with this year.
Why does that make you feel uncomfortable?
Well, it's just, I think it's a lot to...
I think it's a lot to ask of them, Charlie. I think
It's a
that's the
huge
Ask of
challenge.
the kids or ask of the teacher?
Of the teacher. I think that's the problem is,
And the kid, I mean, let's not.
well, definitely,
No,
yeah.
I mean,
But the classroom, though, is significantly now more diverse for the teacher, and the class sizes are gonna be large, even though we use ESSER dollars to
Yeah.
help lower that. And so for that classroom teacher, like Emily, obviously just hugely passionate about every single kid learning at a high level, it's, it's a completely different puzzle, and you haven't worked on that puzzle for more than 9 weeks. So sort of like, I want every kid to succeed, but like, I think it's just like the real concerns about that.
It's not only that it's just been 9 weeks, though. It's 9 weeks post 2 really
Yeah.
weird years.
For sure.
That people are coming in with all sorts of different losses in learning or, losing whatever. I mean, it's a hard time to be.
I anticipated sort of that maybe even as a question, right? It certainly is a talking point post-pandemic, and the one thing, right or wrong, if this was the time to do it, I would be suspicious that we wouldn't have identified even more students for our below-level courses this year than ever, had we left that option. And we maybe would have set even more students up for failure after the pandemic than taking the pathway that we chose.
I wrote down, I had one comment, one question. I think everybody kind of
I haven't,
touched
but
on
I'm waiting.
No, they touched on the exact same thing. So
Right.
I'm going to put in different words, I guess. we talk all about proficiency and assessments and things like that, and you know, we just got my kids' ISASP results, right? I don't know how we expect any kid to be proficient if they're never even put into a class that is teaching the grade level things that they're supposed to be proficient at. So you're just going into the class before the year and start saying, by the end of this, you're not gonna be proficient because we're not teaching the right stuff. So that is a problem that we're trying to solve here, I think. That's part of it. The question I have, and you kind of alluded to it with your answer to Lisa's question, was when the kids are coming into their freshman year and we have whatever it is, 60-some% are going into algebra, how are they dispersed across the classes? Are they just divvied up based on schedules? There's no, like, these kids are all kind of on the lower end, so they get crammed together, and then you're back to sort of tracking them even when they're in the same class? Like, how's that work?
So there's a couple different, I hear two different questions in that, actually.
Kinda.
One, so I'm going to answer how they get in classes first, but then the other question I think we should talk about is how do we avoid tracking within Algebra 1 classes, because that's a different issue. How they're put in classes, there's a couple pieces, and that happens at the building level, but we have a lot of co-taught. So Emily referenced a class that had a lot of needs in that course. And I think the reason we end up in a course like that is because it's probably a co-taught class where we have twice the supports. And our building principals and guidance they're very careful. They have to make sure those courses don't get overloaded, right, with needs, because then we do end up in a situation where accessing the grade level materials is really hard. And it's the first, I don't want to make an excuse and say it's the first time we've done it, but I'm guessing we'll have a lot of takeaways after this year of how we can do that better. Does that answer that question about?
Yeah, I just, you know, if you're not intentional about it, right, you end up with,
Yes.
here's the two classes at West High, and they're doing this,
Right,
you know.
right.
The Algebra 1 classes, Sean, they're completely randomized, like from the schedule standpoint. The sheltered are specific because
Right.
of who we're serving in that, so we want to be very intentional with that. But the other Algebra 1 is completely whatever Infinite Campus spits out.
Yeah, they kick out a schedule.
That's
and
what they have.
Yeah.
Perfect.
The other,
We might have a few co-taught sections too, depending on that, from a, special ed lens as well.
Right, yep.
You might see that, there may be a co-taught algebra, I think you referenced co-taught algebra, and that's.
Is that decided after the, like,
That would be-
the schedule's made and you end
Well,
up
some
with
of that's determined
this-
just by IEPs and such
Yeah.
too, so I mean, you might have certain students that are gonna be assigned to a particular period, and then the rest of that class would be kind of, as Mitch described, the randomized, like, fill in the rest of
Fill in.
the.
But sometimes the randomized will have a class with a lot of IEPs, so then we will have that be the co-taught class, special ed teacher.
I didn't know. The other piece then, I think that tracking within Algebra 1, right? Because as we start to differentiate, sometimes, you identify, I often have this same group of students who need extra support. And so I have been working with some teachers that have asked questions about that already. The idea of tracking is that you're stuck there, right? And so it is fine to have a group of students in an Algebra 1 class that are getting extra support, but they're not only getting extra support, they're getting access to the grade level. And that's very fluid, right? We're assessing those skills. We don't say, oh, you know what? You didn't get the first formative assessment, so the rest of the year you're stuck in this group. We're changing that based on the needs of students. And as we get skilled in that, and I'm saying myself, like as a teacher, as I became more skilled in that, what I learned was that the groups of students do change. And there's also times that kids really benefit from having a conversation with a peer that has a totally, what I would say, different level of readiness for that. Kind of like the example I gave of the student I had at Southeastern. We had two totally different sets of knowledge. We both learned from each other that day. And so within the courses, we want to be really intentional about how we're grouping students and how we're giving access to maybe prerequisite skills so that we don't do tracking within our Algebra 1 classes.
Any other questions from folks? I have a couple things.
I'm sorry, Matt, just so that I'm clear, I don't think this is the right answer. I think what you're doing, what you're trying to do is a much better answer to kids at different levels. And we need to try to teach them so that they actually become interested in calculus, whether or not they actually take it,
So you're saying what we did was, you're on board with what we're doing now?
yes.
Okay.
And I was gonna
Well, I
say-
appreciate that, Troy. Just one thing, Nick, and And part of, one thing I just want to get out is, I do think it just takes a fundamental different way about how we think about math, right? I mean, you got 3 social studies guys sitting here, right? We would never continue to teach one subject over and over, just like Heidi's long division example again, and prevent that kid from being able to access anything else in the social studies curriculum because they were missing that skill. We would keep going on. We keep going on to other courses. We keep going on to other standards and content. But the challenge is different in math because there are some of those things that are so foundational. I think that's what you hear Emily talk about is, I don't know, right? Because it's not the typical way that we've thought about how we do math and how we instruct math about how do we compensate for those real holes. It's challenging for the teacher. It is challenging for the student. It's challenging for all of them to think about it differently. But death sentence is a bad word to use, but it's a gatekeeper is what it is. And if we continue to align something like that, it becomes a gatekeeper that shuts doors in their life.
Right.
That's the consequence. And that consequence, I think, is just too severe to sit and say, we're just going to keep doing that and be okay with that. We have to have the courage to try to change and do better and be better for our kids, knowing that that consequence is so severe.
I think we often find ourselves in that gatekeeper role too, and people are doing it with the best of intentions. So I liken it to the elementary level where there is nobody receiving below grade level standards. The automatic default is you're in your grade level material. And that's not to say that there's not scaffolding that should be occurring in the classroom and or additional intervention. So student falls out on fast math, they're going to be given some additional math interventions. So you fast forward it to what that can look like at the high school level, and that's why that Thinking Mathematically class now has been offered and paired with Algebra 1 and or you've got a sheltered situation for our ELs or COTOC special education class. But if the default isn't, we're going to put you in the grade level standards like Matt says, we have often used the term, it is a death sentence. It is a sentence to being truthfully forever behind. And the consequence is the kids don't have the choices at 11th and 12th grade for, I love what Colin Lewis would say during Portrait of a Graduate, ability to go just to determine whether going into employment, enlistment, or education. And by just simply saying we're giving everybody access at 9th grade, we have totally changed the outcomes for hundreds of kids. It's that impactful. It's not to say it's not easy, it's not going to be growing.
I can tell you got some questions lined
I'm a
up there.
BD teacher, so.
Yeah, so you get it. Yeah, all day long.
So here's the deal. This is exciting, and I'll tell you, Emily, I'm really grateful you came because this is what makes me the most excited. Because unlike Charlie, I do know what this looks like in the classroom because I was there, and my kids were always in math skills, right? And my co-taught class it was basic, whatever, and it was all of the behaviors. They had very few good role models, and it was not a learning environment most of the time, right? And we all know what that looks like, and that's a shame. And now we're not going to do that anymore with math, right? I do think there are some things that I have concerns about, which have to do with logistics, right? Because now you're taking Algebra 1 and you're taking Thinking Math, so you don't get to be a part of music or foreign language. Right? So we have to be realistic about this. And to say we need everybody to take 4 years of math, why? And I'll say this, how is calculus relevant for most people? Just dots. And how is Algebra 2 relevant for most people? And the reason I say that is, do you guys know who George Pipgrass was? He was a pitcher for the 27 Yankees, and he grew up in Schleswig, Iowa. And that's what I learned in Algebra 2. Because I had a teacher who got off topic, and I was not afraid to help that teacher get off topic. Anyway, so I really wonder, is this relevant? And, we are offering a liberal arts college. So from the math coordinator, it's math and it's right, that's your lens, right? But we need our kids to also have rich environments. Now, the thinking math class, right? I'm not saying, we shouldn't do that. Because the truth is, those kids have missed these skills. Right, whatever those skills are, they have been left out of the basic skills. And my daughter's in an AVID school, right? And that's what AVID focuses on is skills. And I don't care what your content is. We all need those skills in every single subject. And so however kids are getting that, if it's the math, thinking math, or whatever, I think that's a critical component, whatever your age level is. But I want to be careful that we're not, it's kind of like in elementary when we just test for reading and math all the time. And then you miss specials or you miss some of these things that make it a richer environment. So I want to be careful there. the overall goal, what you described about having good role models and behavior changing and confidence, that's why we're doing this. And specifically because before we were gatekeeping for mostly black and brown kids. And probably also overall low income kids, whatever your race or ethnicity is, right? That's where those folks go. So one thing, I think the bigger conversation for this is elementary. I think that's where we frankly should put most of our money and our effort, because if you get to 7th grade, I think we're going to have to do all this supplementary stuff if we don't, because I've seen it. I've seen elementary teachers who don't understand the math they're teaching. They actually don't get it. And the problem with that for me with Common Core, because I love Common Core, it's smart, right? It's like, oh no, this is the way. But the problem is if you say, 3rd grader, figure out how to multiply, there's a million ways, you just figure it out. You get a lot of 3rd graders who are like, they just don't know where to begin, right? And I'm not saying drill and kill and this is the only way, but especially if you have someone who doesn't understand math, right? And that, we all know, this is a stereotype. You don't know math, be an elementary school teacher, right? And that's a joke, but I've met elementary teachers who say that joke, themselves. And it's kind of like, oh, and just in our culture, like if you say you're bad at math, everybody's like, oh, you're bad at math. Nobody's like, I'm bad at reading, So math has a stigma, right? And I think all of this stuff we're doing is getting there. I just want to caution this idea that calculus is relevant to anybody unless you're going to use that in your real life. Statistics is literally relevant for every human. Like if you don't understand a deviation from the mean, you're going to miss tons. I encounter statistics all the time in my daily life. In Algebra 2, because I'll get kids with Algebra 2, and I'm like, I can't even help you. I'm not going to confuse you because literally I don't understand what you're doing. Why? Because I haven't seen it for 25 years. And even when I saw it, it wasn't very good to begin with. So I just want to, think, we've got to think about the whole child. And if everything is math and we're relegating, say you don't get to participate in foreign language or music, then we're also shortchanging them some of these other opportunities. And I get it with a schedule. And again, this is the big thinking concept, but when we have a kid who can accomplish Algebra 2 as a freshman, well, that's what we've said the mastery is. Mm-hmm. You mastered it. Move on. Like, whatever that, move on, take a college class as a sophomore. Right? Because I think we're kind of kidding ourselves if we think we're going to give every kid 12 years and we're going to get every kid to mastery in 12 years. Of course we won't. We all learn at different paces. And some kids are going to get that 12-year of education in 9 or 10 years. And some kids are, frankly, going to take 16. And I know we can't do a whole lot about that, just in public ed. And I know that why do we teach Algebra 2? This is my assumption, is because the regents expect us to teach Algebra 2. Because they always have. And they're not rethinking. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of people, I work with a lot of undergrads who come out of school still with the mentality, just tell me what's on the test, and I just need to pass the test. I don't care about the content. I need my degree, and by the way, I need it by this time because I don't want to pay any more money. And that is the system we are feeding into. So if we are going to be leaders, what opportunities do we have to lead on some of this stuff that's like, we want our kids to graduate whole humans with as many experiences as we can give them, understanding that they're all going to be in different places, even when they graduate. And that doesn't say, again, this is the best, one of the most, other than RAM, this is probably the next best step we've taken for true equity, because we absolutely were railroading kids into these and their expectations drop, and they stop caring about school, and they start acting up, and it's hard on all fronts. So I just want to, we're moving in the right direction. I think we have to be super careful. I'm a little skeptical that we're not leaving some things out. I am a little skeptical that we're not actually going to, I know you said we're not. I'm skeptical that's really happening on the ground because you got to slow down. And if you slow down, there's probably things you can't cover. And so I don't believe that we're not going to leave some things out. I'm just being honest that I'll believe that when I see it. I think we're going to get to the end of the year. And here's my big question. If a kid fails, now what? Because the things that are sequential, if you haven't mastered that, and we're just going to say, well, now we're just socially promoting you almost. And there are some benefits to that. I'm not saying that's all wrong, but I am saying if you failed a couple years, or you fail first try, do you just move on to second try? And then how do we identify those skills that you have to master so that you can go on to that? So those, the thrust is exactly what we have to do. And what I'm hearing too is we are paying attention to these logistics, but I don't want to, I don't want to talk like all this is math and then say, well, we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul in some other place, because inevitably. And Jane, your point about your son, here's what I'll tell you, a lot of the kids I see on the inpatient unit, they are taking too many classes. They are overloaded. It isn't good for them. It is not healthy. And they tend to be kids who can't fail. And if they fail, I'm going to literally try to commit suicide. And that's not healthy, right? And so we also, as a system, and Amy, you were right to miss that because we're worried about your GPA, because that's all the system tells us to do. And so the more we can get away from these ideas of credentialing GPAs towards this goal of real mastery and whole child education. So for me, that's why this is very much worth it, because you're going to get those confident kids and you're not going to automatically make a judgment call. And because we're bad at that, right? The kids we pick, clearly we see our implicit bias in that. Clearly we see where we are culturally, right? Because that's how the system is designed. So is this the right time to do it? There is no right time to do it. So when's the time to do it? Now's the time to do it. Rip the Band-Aid off after a pandemic. Everything's harder. But if we don't do it, if we wait for the right time, it won't happen, right? It just is an excuse to sit. So I know it's uncomfortable for teachers. I know it's hard. I am hearing, as you can imagine, from lots of folks, math teachers. But I think we have to do it. I think we have to rip the Band-Aid off and not lose sight of that whole child and not get so hung up. And again, we're fighting against a system, but not like what is relevant for kids, and is calculus relevant? Is Algebra 2 relevant?
Not for everybody.
Not for
and I
everybody.
hope that's what you kind of hear us say.
You're
there too,
right on
JP.
board
Yeah,
with the
I mean,
thinking behind
Okay.
all
yeah,
of this.
I think you hit
Yeah.
on like all of the pieces that it feels like our team's having the conversation around, right? And it's trying to figure out what are the right answers to that. And I'm not sure there's any scripted right answer to those, but I think you're outlining a lot of the very challenges that we're talking about. Our high school principals have a lot of this conversation with the same thing around kids in Algebra 2, kids that are going a different path. What makes sense for them, might not make sense for another kid, and trying to have some flexibility there. You talked about, it goes back to that gatekeeper argument around, okay, well, does that limit your ability to take other courses? I'm not sure, music and language, if we look at our black and brown students in music and language, is that a really high number of kids in either of those? Probably not, but are they missing other opportunities? And then what are we allowing for other opportunities later in the high school experience, as long as we don't close the door on them early on, right? I think that's the risk of the other model we were doing, is how many doors are being closed simultaneously. So even if you were passionate about this, well, we're slamming the door in your face as we go along, because you're never going to get to pursue one of those things because you haven't had the relevant experience. So you hit on this whole host of them, JP, and I think we're having conversations around all of those components. And like you said, I don't think there's a right time to sit down and say, well, now we're ready, because we're not going to be ready until we experience some of this, and we can adjust and support our kids differently. But sorry.
I was just going to chime in and say, even the thinking mathematically thing, I agree completely. We had some kids come up, to our attention, like, hey, so-and-so likes to take this, I'm just going to make something up, like wood shop class or something, right? If that's the thing that gets a kid to school, absolutely. I don't want them in a double math class if they already hate math and they, you know what I mean? And that art class or whatever class is the thing that's getting the kid to school, absolutely that's where that kid needs to be. We're going to have to lift heavier for that kid in the Algebra 1 class. We're probably going to have to provide some interventions and extra things that could have been met. And that's where it is just such delicate work from kid to kid. You're spot on with the calculus thing. I mean, that book I referenced about reinvigorating high school math, they say that even of math majors, only 20% of them is calculus actually relevant to their work.
Yeah.
And so the goal certainly isn't to get kids through calculus. I think the question, and I don't know that I made this clear earlier, is if we're pushing this large chunk of our kids to take calculus as seniors, and that's making our grade level courses more inequitable, we better make sure that all those kids taking calculus are, am I connecting that dot there?
Yeah, it is. And I think there's a lot of people thinking that, right?
Yeah.
And again, we've inherited the system and nobody wants to change. Well, we've always done it. I mean, for you, Sean, to say I'll just guess 20 years ago, right?
Sure.
Me too, right? like, the fact that this system is the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago should feel a little insane. Like, how nothing is the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago.
JP, that's why I think we've got to talk to the regions, because Nick Proud and Justin Colbert and I, last week, were really focusing on how just to get a regular stats class, part of the program of studies.
Right.
And we were making good progress until we saw you and I would say, Iowa won't recognize it. You have to have algebra too, so that's where it's hard to tell our kids to.
And
go
it
that
is,
route.
yeah, and I get it. We
Right,
have
so-
to fit in that system. But again, if we are going to be, where does it start?
Right.
Right. So again, I don't want to. I'm not going to say let's throw those kids under the bus and disadvantage them. Although I'll tell you, if they know stats, we know we're going to advantage them because they know stats. And I mean, I didn't learn stats until grad school. And it was one of the hardest classes I took because I'd never had stats before. But boy, now, once you know it, it's like you use it all the time and it exists. So, I mean, it's good. I'm hopeful. I really do want to see what happens at elementary because I think that's where we're going to, I think that's kind of, from
Yeah, I
six.
think that was a great point too, and sorry to cut you off, JP,
No.
but like we talked about secondary pathways today, right? I mean, we could do a whole other, project around what does elementary math look like? What are we trying to do with elementary math? Heidi alluded to junior high a couple times around some of the components, but it does have to be a K-12 conversation, right? Because it'd be great to say that someday we don't need a thinking mathematically course, right?
Yes.
That's a temporary solution for us right now as we weather through a change, and that we would be able to eliminate that, or that our junior high progressions are so solid and kids are so well prepared to step into that Algebra 1. So I do think there's multiple layers to the conversation. This is a component of it. This one, I think, though, was so obvious and so ugly in some ways. It's like, okay, we're compelled to do something, right? That we have to do something here. We can't stop, though, on those other conversations and think that the problem's going to solve itself either, just through this simple change, right?
Sure. Well, this is going to present more problems that are going to come up
Yep.
that we're going to have to solve. So it's. I mean, it is exciting and it's scary because it is such a big shift, all at once.
Yep.
And if so for the math teachers, I do feel the most because I don't know that we've ever done as big of a shift in any department ever all at once, saying all of a sudden, boom, and maybe that's a little heads up. I don't know. Do we still have those other lower level in other subject areas?
If we showed you other subject areas compared to those math progressions, I think it'd be pretty obvious.
It was never as.
No,
it was never
Nothing
that.
like
I know that.
Yeah.
But
I mean, we have like an honors, right, for some courses, and we have a standard, but
But,
we
moving
don't have the
towards
lower level
treating all
subjects
classes
that way.
with
Yeah.
a similar mindset,
Right. Yeah.
which would probably be easier in every other subject because you don't have as much sequential,
Right.
if any, real.
And just the societal beliefs about, Matt alluded to that earlier, just thinking about how math is learned and what it means to be good at math and all of that.
Yeah.
Well, just like Heidi said, so I mean, we all have this operating belief that all of it's sequential, right? We heard the international community teaches integrated mathematics throughout, right? And it's looped through. So that's our working assumption and belief. That doesn't mean it's still not a real challenge to work with our staff about how does that look and feel differently, and how can kids still access standards even if they have a hole, here, and how do we compensate for that? So
And I think
I don't think it's impossible. It's definitely different.
It looks like elementary, from what I can tell, right? My daughter's elementary. It looks like it's moving away from that idea, right? It looks like it's more integrated. I've seen geometry concepts in her third grade math book or
Yeah.
whatever. So, but I don't know that we know how to teach that yet. I think that's where we're behind. That Common Core is up here pushing some of the best thinking, but I don't know that all of our all of the we haven't been doing that very much, and so maybe that's part of this learning is, well, here's the best practice. How do we get everybody on board with that? Without these old, tropes and ideas about that aren't really accurate.
Can I just add that I do think some kids like math. And so when I hear things like Algebra 2, why are we even like, I don't think that we should be taking away our accelerated track totally. I think that kids I'm very, I was double accelerated.
Yeah.
And not because I was identified in 5th grade as super smart. This is so kind of geeky, but over the summer I went to Iowa State and I taught myself pre-Al one summer and then Algebra 2 because I loved math. And so I think we still need to offer high-level math offerings for kids who want to, and 16 kids in the district who are double accelerated, that seems like the right number to me. I think 40% single accelerated, that seems really high to me. And I'm concerned about, I just want to accelerate so that I can punch out my 3 years of math and then cut math my last year. Then I'm not sure you should be on an accelerated track, because you don't have the passion and the interest in learning. I think you would be better served than in the regularly paced sequence. And I also come to that thinking because I sat in on a regularly paced algebra class a couple of weeks ago. They're tough right now. I think there's a huge spectrum and this one was particularly interesting because there were several IEP plans, and there was a co-taught teacher in there because of the number of IEPs, and there were 2 or 3 paras, student-specific paras in the class. And given the diversity in learning spectrums on the learning, that's a tough class to teach, and I think that some of our teachers are struggling with that. If we take some of the 40% that maybe really shouldn't be accelerated and we kind of even out those classes more, I think that algebra, regular paced algebra, would become more manageable from a teaching perspective, because it's the same philosophy behind the ramp.
Yeah.
Right?
I appreciate that. And I don't want to get it accelerated, right? I want it to be there for the folks who need it, but that's a good perspective about it.
Yeah, it's really geeky. It's a good thing hardly anyone listens.
It's okay.
JD, can I ask one thing?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, Emily, like being the math teacher in the table, given this is where we're going, and this has been the process, like in your opinion, what do math teachers need to be able to do this effectively and have the impact that we want?
Well, I think one of the biggest struggles I have is the level of, we have from low to high, and I think you get that with any class, I get it, but you've already had this big of a thing in Algebra 1, because we don't have an honors track. So like anybody that's like, gets concepts fast, or has some interest, like they don't have an option. So we've already had this big thing, and now you've extended it farther, and I'm struggling with reaching it's just a lot. So while we're not trying to drop any standards, we're not trying to do anything like that, I can see the rigor dropping already. And I think opening up a little bit in terms of like offering like an honors option or something like that would help a lot in an Algebra 1 classroom, just because of the monumental stretch. Because you're getting kids that didn't master 7th and 8th grade standard. I mean, you're assuming everybody that goes to GO and Algebra 2 have gotten Algebra 1, GO, and then whatever, right? Like they passed the previous class. Algebra 1 is the only class that doesn't have that as a prerequisite. It's everybody. So I think that's part of it. I think that would help. The other thing that would help is, I'm trying to think. We've also not had time yet to talk as an Algebra 1 team, so it's also really just hard to gauge how we're doing, because I'm not an island because I have my team, but I am an island at West, and there's an island at City, and there's an island at Liberty, and we don't. So it would be interesting to see just like what everyone else is doing, because I feel like I just hear the same voices over and over and over. And so we have our thing, and that's fine, but I'd like to know the other things. And then I also haven't seen that many like really differentiated high school math classrooms, so it'd be interesting to see like how are other people doing it. Even before I was in the Iowa City district, I was at Solon, and they did this not even no, it was like my first year was their first year of doing this. So I've been through this already, and now I'm through it again. that being said, they still, I mean, they're a different kind of case because they're in block schedule, so kids can get made up. Like, if they were behind, they could get caught up, because you could do 2 years of math in 1 year. And they still offered pre-algebra, so the kids that were really low level, like, they had a chance to maybe look at some more skills and maybe get caught up, like, but still, it's not gonna be perfect. So I'm interested in seeing more of those things, because, like, math hasn't changed a lot. You generally see a lot of the same things you were doing, because people teach like they were taught, unless they make an active effort to change. So seeing how that works would be interesting, just because we have such a diverse thing. So
I love the last couple of things you said, and I think that's something we've talked about in the last couple of weeks too, Emily.
Yeah.
Is like, okay, we can't just make the change, right, and then have teachers do everything they've always done and think that the problem's going to be solved, right? Like, okay, what kind of collaboration, PD, and support, do you need to be given? Because like you said, okay, if we're going to do something different, then what else do we need to know? How else do I need to approach, this on a consistent basis? So I definitely want you to know we hear that and want to be able to respond to that in some fashion. So.
And PD with your colleagues across town. Like having some time.
I think it would be, I mean, I've had an
Or time with
opportunity to talk with my sheltered ELL, Algebra 1s, and it was productive, because then we could see if pacing was similar and what kind of expectations we had and what other people were doing. I mean, it wasn't perfect because our scenarios aren't the same. There's a drastic difference in how our classes are made up and whatever, but I think it would be interesting, because even talking to my sheltered ELL kids or teachers, there's very different ways of what this looks like in different schools, and pacing and all that kind of stuff is very different. And so I don't know how, like, I'd be interested just to talk to them to see, like, how did they see this going, because we're trying to do the same thing. I mean, it's different, but we're trying to cover the same amount of material with different kids. And so it's a lot of stress. And yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. I know this is a lot. We're like, why don't you speak for all the math teachers in this room? Right? So it's a lot, and never apologize for your passion, because this is why you're good at what you do, is you care about those kids. And I really appreciate you coming, because we don't get that perspective, right? We're just not in the buildings as a board, and so it's really helpful to hear it in such an honest and thoughtful way.
And also, listening to JP and Lisa, your description reminded to me the reason we're doing this is because we have failed to teach black and brown kids math, and whatever we do, we've got to do that.
Any other comments, questions? Thanks a lot. This was really good.
Thank you, guys.
This is a good ed committee, like robust. We get some raw, that's good, and some really hard, difficult conversations that is also really healthy and good. So thank you.
I told Matt beforehand too, there's a lot of resources. We shared one chapter
Okay.
of a book with you, but I'll put together a document and share with him, and he'll get it to the board in
Great.
terms of, like, if you're curious about more reading about this, what are some models where we do alternative things to Algebra 2
Yeah.
and some of that, there's a lot out there, and I'll get it to you.
Great, thank you.
Even a
We'll read
podcast.
that in
makes
the
sense,
Oh, yeah,
so.
yeah.
I'm
We could do a
not,
podcast, yeah.
I use math every day.
Thank you.
And that's our only
But I
topic.
cut my mouth shut on that.
Oh,
I
okay.
listen.
The minutes, yeah.
Can we
led with how bad.
We haven't adjourned. We haven't had a motion to adjourn, so we can go back and do
did
it.
folks have a chance to look at those minutes from December?
Of 2019, sure did.
2019.
Super excited to approve them. I move, yeah, I second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great.